Hello. Thank you to MOSIP for such a wonderful event and for allowing me to present to all of you this morning. My name is Behlendorf. As mentioned, I'm the CTO for the Open Wallet Foundation. I have been connected to the MOSIP project since early in its career. I participated in a workshop in January of 2019 where I met some of you in this room. It was 6 months into the MOSIP project, and there was a lot of conversation amongst the stakeholders and some of the funders about the technology strategy for the project. And I remember being quite forceful in advocating that the technology development be open source, not just as a way to try to achieve greater security and greater inclusiveness, but to really accelerate development and discover partnerships that might not otherwise be possible by being more open and transparent about how it works. I've been very gratified to see the current state of the project in manifesting that vision. It was actually really great to hear yesterday the presentation by Mr. Yohabe who ran the project here in Ethiopia, where he described as he was investigating whether MOSIP would be a suitable project to do a pilot with, he said he went straight to GitHub and downloaded the code, and without asking anybody for permission, without asking anybody for guidance, he told his developers, could you evaluate this and start running this, and let's see if this is something we can use and perhaps even take to production. And that was only because the project was open source, that they were able to get such a rapid leap from, hey, maybe this is possible, to, hey, this is something that will work for us and let's go forward. What I thought I would talk with you about today is a little bit about the Open Wallet Foundation and how what we're working on we think is going to be highly compatible with the goals of the MOSIP community, and perhaps there's a basis for collaboration between us. In fact, I know there is, and we're working now on that. But I also wanted to talk a little bit about the theory of change and the theory of adoption of open source that drives really the Linux Foundation. Because that's, the Linux Foundation is the home of the Open Wallet Foundation. It is the home, and I'll talk about this in a bit, for almost 1,000 other major open source projects that serve at the core of many of the horizontal layers of the technology community. The Linux Foundation is perhaps the largest shared technology investment project in history. And we're about trying to enable open collaboration across companies, developers, and users to really establish not just open platforms, but really help make sure that 70 to 90% of the technology stack that is open source is built to the same level of quality, resiliency, and confidence that one expects from and one needs from software that forms the underpinning for society. We are a nonprofit organization, and we're focused on building ecosystems, on really being the neutral governance at the heart of so many of these projects. And just some basic statistics about the Linux Foundation, which it's almost 20 years old. In fact, it was really incorporated as the Linux Foundation in about 2007. But it was built on top of some pre-existing efforts in this domain. And in those nearly 20 years, it's signed on over 3,000 major, companies, large and small, nonprofits, government organizations, et cetera, including 100 of the Fortune 100 tech and telecom companies. Last year, we saw almost 1 million developers contributing code to one of our repositories. As I mentioned, and probably actually as of this point, since the making of this slide, we crossed the 1,000 different projects under our banner model, creating, by some estimates, if you take a standard measure of value per line of code, $100 billion in shared value across all of these different initiatives. Now, that number is very hard to ascertain when everything everything you do, you give away for free. But Harvard the Harvard Business School recently published a study attributing more than $8 trillion of economic demand-side value in software created by the open source community, and we believe we're a healthy part of that. We also run other things that are a part of making these projects successful, and I'll talk about that more in a bit. But along the way, we've trained more than 2 million developers on open source technologies related to the initiatives that we house. And most of our projects are about open source code, but we really view there being a range of different kinds of collaborative initiatives out there, ranging from standards and open specifications work to open hardware initiatives. We have something called RISC-V, which is an open chip CPU project built by that serves kind of as an alternative to Intel and AMD, all the way to governance networks that use either blockchain technology or other technologies to serve as trust frameworks in a lot of different communities. And we have initiatives in all these domains. To give kind of a snapshot very quickly of where we kind of sit, we've got projects under our banner, for example, in the cloud community. We have the Cloud Native Compute Foundation, which is the home for Kubernetes. And if any of you are developers building cloud applications, you know that Kubernetes is the predominant, essentially, operating system for the cloud. It's one of those things where you'd kind of be crazy not to use it. You'd have to be highly justified in not using it. And it's a key part of the reason why you can take cloud compute loads running at AWS and move them with no change in programming over to Google or over to Microsoft's cloud environment, or to one provided by a startup or a local company or that sort of thing. In the networking space, a project called ONAP serves as the open source software-defined networking infrastructure that provides services for 70% of the world's mobile phone subscribers. It's a remarkable collaboration between a whole lot of companies, but led by AT&T and China Mobile. The Open Source Security Foundation, which is an initiative I led for 2 years while being at the Linux Foundation, has been funding open source security work across the gamut and really looking at the full supply chain of software security, and has made major grants to many of the other open source foundations in this domain. I can go on with examples from automotive, where we've got software inside of over 50% of cars that are shipping today due to a partnership called the Automotive Grade Linux Initiative that combines Toyota and GM and Mazda and Ford and others into a shared operating system for automotive telematics, to web technologies using Node.js, which runs behind roughly 60% of websites today. And another initiative I used to lead, this was my first project at the Linux Foundation, called Hyperledger, which is a permissioned blockchain infrastructure play, and it sits, one of its technologies sits behind over 50% of the central bank digital currency projects out there. But it was also the home for this interesting set of projects loosely coupled around the name Ares. And I'll get to this in a bit, but the wallets that were a part of the Ares initiative, which was to provide decentralized, self-sovereign identity technologies, is a project that has been picked up and used, and in fact funded in large part by the Canadian government. It's seen deployment by communities like, companies and organizations like CETA, who run the IT behind a lot of the international flight information and baggage and other kinds of metadata used by the travel and logistics industry. And Hyperledger was really the home for a lot of our original projects. But these aren't just about horizontal technologies and the kind of boring meat and potato behind infrastructure out there. We're also starting to see projects that are very vertical, that are targeting domains and aim to have an impact that very much address, the sustainable development goals, if you want to look at it that way, or potentially domains that you might not have thought open source software would apply to, such as in the energy domain. We have an initiative called LF Energy that is comprised of partnerships between some of the major power grid operators in Europe and soon the United States and Asia, hardware vendors making some of the big iron that's used to manage the power grid, as well as entrepreneurs building solutions for microgrids, increasingly combinations of solar, battery, and local connections to try to provide greater resiliency to the electric industry. In the environment, we have a couple of initiatives, one of them being OS Climate, which is actually more of an open data project than a software project, and it's about informing many of the carbon trading markets that are out there with higher quality data, and I can go into more in depth on that. And then there's another one we recently launched in partnership with the Gates Foundation called Tazama, which is a platform focused on anti-fraud and KYC to really help help bank the unbanked, basically, to help bring in, to reduce the costs of anti-fraud so that more and more of the world's citizens can be brought into the financial community. So what do all these projects have in common? And kind of pointing out the scope, they all depend upon the the Foundation providing a core set of services, if you'll think of it that way. First off, it's important to have a neutral organization at the heart of these communities. To have a community that, to have an organization that doesn't have skin in the game in a particular domain, right? Isn't trying to look at this as some sort of rivalry with some of the other participants, isn't in competition with the participants for delivering the product to the market, right? But is actually upstream from a lot of that and can run a governance process that is unquestionably objective, neutral, and fair. We also believe it's important to provide IP clarity. You want people to understand, you want the organizations to be able to have confidence that all the code that came in, from whatever source it came in, even somebody hiding behind a Gmail address, right, that you've got all of the rights and assurances from all those parties to avoid submarine patent issues, to avoid IP theft kinds of issues, and that everything is consistently licensed, and the trademarks are there and all of that, so that basically you can bring down the cost of compliance and bring down the risk of deploying this open source code. Maybe some of us are battle scarred from 25 years ago when certain large companies based in Redmond, Washington were referring to open source as a cancer, and we felt we had to really upgrade and up-level the respectability but really the clarity and the comprehensibility of open source to the public, and so IP clarity became a major part of that. We also believe it's really important, and this is something we share with a lot of other open source projects, to drive the governance around the development of the software as a duocracy, meaning that the developers who show up and do the work, the ones who are initially at the heart of that project, you bootstrap any open source project with a set of contributors, ideally from more than one or two organizations, and they have a rhythm, they have a pattern, they're publishing things, and when somebody new shows up with something valuable to contribute in the form of a pull request, in the form of enhancements to your architecture, you open the door to them. You allow them to step in, and if, by the force of their contributions, they prove themselves of worth, then you bring them in as a peer to the other contributors to that project. That duocracy, it's a much better term than meritocracy, I think, and certainly there's a role for the organizations that help fund these different initiatives to play a role in deciding how money is spent around these initiatives. But when it comes to deciding how the technology is built, you have to trust the technologists. You have to leave it up to the people who show up to really decide the direction that things go. And finally, you do need a financial support ecosystem. First off, supporting the heart of these kinds of projects does take some human capital, does take some processes, some systems, does take some legal help sometimes. And so you do need a way to go and identify and encourage the set of organizations who are stakeholders in these initiatives to be a part of funding that core operation. You never want to turn this into a massive thing if you can avoid it. You always want to focus on minimum viable, but you still need that at its heart. And in return, you want to find ways for the code in these projects to go and have a life well beyond those contributors, right? You want to market this code. You want the world to understand why they should be using Kubernetes or Hyperledger Fabric or any of these different initiatives, right? And so sometimes that means holding events, like MOSIP Connect, right? It means going and funding educational materials, those sorts of things. And so you need that financial support ecosystem. And sometimes you need to pay some developers to write some code, making grants for small contributions or bug bounties or audits, security audits of code. Those are things that sometimes it's hard to find volunteers to do. And so having an infrastructure to be able to support that is super important. And in the course of doing this, what we think is the most sustainable model for any open source project in the long term. And really, we want to think about how do we ensure that these projects live for tens of years, not just for a cycle or while something is a flash in the pan and then next year it's a different infrastructure. But how do we get something with the longevity that enterprises can trust it, that governments can trust it, and know that it's going to be there longer than any one of the individual companies or developers is going to be there. Linus Torvalds is kind of unique, right? He's been doing the same open source project for the last 33 years, sorry, and that's great, but he's definitely the exception. And even in the course of that, figuring out how to provide sustainability to the Linux kernel project has been pretty important to us. So we believe that comes from ensuring that around every open source project is a ring of organizations that are deriving value from that code. And that can be commercial value in the form of products and services they take to market. It can be in the form of use value because they use it to solve their own problems. But figuring out a way to encourage those organizations to feed back into the core development as a virtuous loop is a big part of what we're trying to enable here. And for the most part in our history, we have focused on companies. That's not because we are rabid venture capitalists or anything like that. It's been because they've generally been the most ambitious about adopting and driving open source software. As somebody who's been talking to government organizations and nonprofits for more than 20 years about the value of open source software, that's a learned perspective, right? But a hard-earned perspective. But I also want to emphasize today, we can absolutely see these NGOs and these governments participating in these kinds of projects as peers to the commercial organizations that are involved. Again, on the technology side, it really is a function of who shows up with contributions to the code or extensions or bug fixes or security audits or any other kind of contribution. We also think, though, it's important to engage NGOs and governments in some unique ways, and I'll talk about that in a little bit of how we do that at the Open Wallet Foundation. So now let me pivot. Thank you for indulging me. Basically, we've found this to be a pattern for how to run open source projects. But now let's talk about wallets. And why did we come up with the Open Wallet Foundation? Why did we launch that? And first off, we launched pretty recently. We had this kind of pre-announcement of it in October of 2022, and then more formally launched it in February of 2023. And it seemed to us at the time that there was this very clear nexus emerging between some technology proof points and the world of policy around digital identity and verifiable credentials and those sorts of things. So on the technology side, verifiable credential standards at the W3C, at ISO, and at projects like the Decentralized Identity Foundation and the Trust over IP Foundation had started to reach stability. We'd seen implementations, we'd seen a couple of different iterations of each of those standards, and production systems had been pushed out supporting those standards. And a lot of really sharp people were involved. And one of the big drivers for that had, ironically, or silver linings, abound here, had been COVID. A lot of the participants in this community, Kalia here being one of them, and I'm sure many of you, got really involved in this space during the pandemic because we felt that there were some really urgent use cases that were needed to get us out of the pandemic that called for some of these technologies if we could get them done right. An easy example of this is proof of vaccination status, right? And so we set about trying to look at the stack of technologies that we had in 2020 and started to look at, certain use cases when that suddenly became really important in the context of providing that proof of vaccination status to be able to board a plane, to be able to go to a restaurant perhaps, right? Where suddenly the importance of selective disclosure and other privacy-preserving approaches, other decentralized approaches, really came to fore. And so in that window of time, we were able to see successful deployments of a set of technologies, not universal, but in certain countries and certain regions for certain use cases, that proved to us that we had to do a lot in the core to achieve these really high goals around privacy, but we did that. And there's still work going on. You might hear acronyms thrown out there, such as SD-JOT, selected disclosure types of formats, BBS Plus, these sorts of things that show there's still somewhat of a healthy ecosystem here around the standards. But these are really finishing touches. The core, I think, has proven itself in that window of time. And of course, I want to give credit to MOSIP. I think you all had proven, even by 2022, there's this inexorable momentum towards digital identity, and kind of once you have that, the value of verifiable credentials on top becomes pretty obvious. That demonstrated we can actually go from good ideas, good technologies, to implementation and adoption by 100 million people. It's such a tremendous number in a reasonable amount of time. And on the policy side, what really perked up everybody was a couple things. One is the EIDAS regulations in the European Union, which were just passed last week in final form, that have called now within 2 years' time for the member states in the European Union to have to publish wallets that can hold credentials issued by member states and by the European Union within the next 2 years. And those wallets must be open source. Of course, our goal is to make sure that those wallets are not just open source at the end of some development process, but actually open source through the development process, and that we use open source as a way to drive collaboration between them. We also seen, kind of independently, a lot of momentum around, and this is more related to the first point, mobile driver's licenses standards in ISO and in other domains, but really at a policy level, nation states starting to realize the value of pushing for those and pushing for cross-border adoption between them. And then finally, a whole bunch of other use cases that really had started to bear out. In the British Columbia and in Canada, the use cases pioneered there around business registrations and licensing around access to natural resources, right? This idea of enterprise wallets kind of opened a lot of people's eyes to the prospect of using verifiable credentials as the point of integration when you have disparate government systems and disparate business systems that you need to act as a unified kind of space rather than waiting for all those to be unified behind the scenes. Unifying them around the individual business owner as the pivot point in those use cases is just so much more powerful. So all this good stuff was happening, but the wallet technology landscape was still very cluttered and very dispersed. And this was because there are lots of implementations of protocols, implementations of standards, format standards and the like that were done as libraries in different languages, that were part of commercial solutions in the wallet space with some components kind of being tossed out, but nothing that really brought a lot of them together. And then other initiatives such as those under Hyperledger around the Hyperledger Aries project that had started out life very much connected to a server-side component, Hyperledger Indy, that was a blockchain platform, but really deserved a life beyond that story, and could certainly be used and be targeted at use cases around trust frameworks that were very much not in the blockchain space. So that kind of association, and of course, digital wallets with cryptocurrencies and the like, also kind of hindered our ability to bring these pieces together. And many of these projects, again, were built for pilots and had that kind of first-gen kind of feel, but weren't really technologies that could scale up to 100 million users. Like many of you have had that experience now, scaling your technology to meet the needs of 100 million, which, as you know, is a very different domain. And finally, the competitive landscape was very rough. Wallets are not the place where companies should be building a business model around, right? This is actually one place where it's different from web browsers, where Google has made billions of dollars by having Chrome out there and driving a lot of traffic through it that they've been able to monetize in the form of advertising. Well, you wouldn't want advertising in a wallet any more than you really wanted in a mail client, right? So the business models around wallets meant that there wasn't any commercial actor really driving aggregation in the domain, except for the two parties who run the world's mobile operating systems. And for better or worse, whatever, they provided default wallets. And if that were, at the end of the day, the way that 90% of the people were to experience digital identity, I think we all agree that that would be a significant hindrance to competition and to innovation. And frankly, the last thing that a government wants to do is to tell its citizens to use Google Pay or Google Wallet or Apple Pay to access core citizen services, right? So So we developed, so we formed OpenWallet to try to address this need for a neutral home for open source wallet efforts, to really focus on the software engineering behind these wallets. How do we bring these different pieces together under one roof? How do we get them to integrate between themselves and accelerate development? But out of scope for this were standards. There are plenty of organizations doing standards well, or certification programs, or consumer services, or trust frameworks. We also, and this is per the Linux Foundation standard model, aren't about delivering wallets to the end users. This is about depending upon the community to do it. And I'm going to go a little bit more quickly through a couple of these slides, just in the interest of time. But really it was to say, kind of like the web browser market, we wanted to find a way to make the majority of what's behind these wallets open source, while still allowing for customization by organizations and communities that would actually go and publish these apps into app stores. And that means working not just with the open source projects, but with governments, with standards bodies, and with the organizations that publish these into the app stores, to focus on a sustainability model at the core. We've got a set of projects that look, frankly, like an alphabet soup of oddly named little bits that provide support for different pieces. But we recently added a core wallet engine called Bifold, which we're aiming to build into the core of a wallet stack that then can go and be rebranded for public consumption. And we think this is super essential as a way to build essentially a common stack of technologies that can cut the cost of those organizations that hope to provide that last mile of service. We're partnered in this with a bunch of very interesting organizations. I won't go into depth, although you'll notice that one of those is one of those two big tech companies who read the writing on the wall, and we believe we can bring the other one in at a certain point. We've got a model for engaging the public sector as well in what we do. I give the space for the technologists who are working within those governments on the government-branded wallets, to be able to see where the landscape is heading and to have a kind of a gentler way to onboard into our community than just throwing them at our Discord server and the like. And in particular, we're eager to work with MOSIP, and we've already got conversations going on with many of you in the room about the right ways to do this. At the very least, you all are welcome to use the code from the Open Wallet Foundation as ingredients, especially in INGI, perhaps even in eSignet and other technologies, whether it's in the current version or a future iteration, so that we can combine efforts. But maybe we look at, in the long term, the credential effort you have around NG being aligned with one of our wallet stacks, with MOSIP being at the core of really a lot of the efforts that we do. The door is really open, the future is very bright. We are highly aligned as communities, and I can't wait to tell the rest of the world, as we do, about all of you here at MOSIP who've delivered to 100 million users effectively an open source platform, not just for digital identity, but as I think we'll see, for the verifiable credentials and these amazing use cases we get from them. And I'm really eager to work on all of that with you. So thank you for the opportunity, and I'll be here the rest of today and look forward to meeting all of you. Thank you.